The morning he stood before the bathroom mirror, the man realized he had been carrying too much for too long. The light from the window cut the room in half. The coffee pot clicked off in the kitchen. He looked at the line of his jaw, at the familiar scar near the eyebrow, and felt a hollowness where recognition should have lived. Success sat on his resume like a medal, but behind it there was a hollow that never seemed to fill. The weight he carried wasn't just work or obligation, it was a shape pressed onto his chest, an accumulation of promises he had made to survive, of roles he had accepted to be safe. He touched the glass as if to touch himself. The surface was cool. For a moment he tried to remember when the stranger's smile had become his default. He remembered applause, then remembered the exact words his father used after awards and corrections. He remembered being taught to quiet questions in order to keep the peace. Those memories looked small and sharp in the morning light, like artifacts half buried in sand. The man felt something loosen and at the same time a tremor of fear. If he let go of what he had carried, what would remain? Chapter 1. The Great Identity Theft. At 6, the man learned that being quiet saved dinner. At 9, that getting the top grade gained a smile. At 16, that agreeing with the group kept him in. Those lessons were not malign, they were survival. They were the first stones of an edifice he would build to keep himself upright. Over the years, those stones turned into rooms and corridors, and then into an entire mansion that looked like him, but was occupied by expectations, shoulds, and the echo of other people's voices. The scene that marked the theft was subtle. It was a parent-teacher conference in which a kindly teacher praised his punctuality and compliance and, without malice, suggested he aim lower so he wouldn't set expectations for a younger sibling. The man's response was an automatic nod, the same nod he used at every turn to keep a relationship intact. He learned to prioritize other people's comfort over his own edges. He learned to make himself small. In the years that followed, those small protective behaviors became identity. When colleagues described him as dependable, he felt relief. When friends called him steady, he felt relief. Those external labels felt safe because they came with predictability. Labels became maps, maps became habits, and habits rooted into his nervous system as pathways that over time felt like the only routes home. This is where the theft happens, not as a dramatic moment, but as a long, incremental reassignment of the self. You stop asking what you want because asking has been punished, corrected, or overridden by someone else's needs. You begin to listen not to your own curiosity, but to the rumble of what others expect. The false self, the part of him that performed to keep things smooth, grows elaborate and convincing. It promises safety and pays in small, quiet losses. Reflective prompt. Stand before a mirror tonight. Ask, which voices do I hear when I try to say what I want? Name 3. Say them aloud only to yourself. Notice whether your throat tightens, whether your hands search for stillness. Keep the list. These are starting points, not judgments. If this scene lands true for you, there's a short companion workbook that outlines 3 micro-exercises to begin unwinding what you carry. It contains the mirror prompt, a simple somatic check, and a values list to start clarifying what belongs to you. Consider downloading it for guided practice. At work, he was the reliable one. At home, he was the peacemaker. Even in friendships, his humor arrived early and his dissent arrived late, if at all. Roles accumulated like luggage tags on a suitcase, each one presented to the world an edited version that made contact safe. Yet each tag was also a contract, a whispered agreement to perform until the performance no longer fit.
Chapter 2. The Subconscious Prison. The meeting began with coffee and project updates. He listened as a junior colleague, brimming with an idea that slightly diverged from the plan, stumbled over the phrase, "I wonder if—" The room smiled politely. The man felt the old pull, smooth things over, translate the idea into acceptable terms, keep the coalition intact. When the opportunity to speak came, he rehearsed a soft, cautious version of the dissenting thought he'd had the night before. He delivered it as a question. It passed, neutralized, as if it had always been meant that way. There is an invisible architecture beneath behavior, the brain's way of filtering what matters. It is not a moral judge, it is a survival system. The reticular activating system, attention biases, and habit circuits guide where you look and how you react. Over time, repeated choices carve roads in the mind. The man's road system favored safety. Routes that led to approval were widened and paved with repetition. Roads that might take him toward risk, curiosity, or discomfort were allowed to remain gravel paths that sprouted weeds. This is not failure, it is efficiency. The mind tends to automate to save energy. The trouble is that automation can become a prison when it preserves early survival strategies rather than present truths. The man's nervous system had learned, be agreeable, minimize disturbance, keep the peace. When a new reality required a different response, a more honest dissent, an authentic preference, a boundary, the body's old roads insisted on the old travel. Micro-exercise. Somatic check. Stop where you are. Place one hand on your chest, one on your belly. Inhale for 4 counts. Hold for 2. Exhale for 6. Notice where tension gathers. Name the sensation. Tight, hollow, burning, numb. Make a small note. What was happening right before you felt this? Do this 3 times today in different settings.
The exercise trains attention back to physical cues that signal when the old roads are taking over. At the end of the meeting, someone praised his composure. He said thank you, voice even. In the car, he let the breath he had been holding out. A small shame visited, quick and familiar, like a ghost muscle memory. He thought of the way his mother had said, "No waves," and felt the contact between that command and his parent posture. The prison was not a cell with bars. It was a set of soft cushions that shaped him until he matched their contour. Chapter 3. The False Self-Empire. Imagine an empire mapped across his day. Manager, partner, son, friend, board member, mentor. Each title required scripts. The manager dressed in competence. The partner performed calm. The son performed compliance. In private, the empire's attendants, a chorus of inner voices, applauded or jeered depending on performance. The inner critic, slender and precise, kept accounts. Its voice was often practical, sometimes brutal. "You should have known better," it would say. "You can't risk that." The false self presided from a high chair, trading authenticity for safety and calling it wisdom. Montage. He laughed at a joke he didn't find funny. He arrived early to another meeting to ensure his attendance was noticed. He accepted a promotion that meant less time for writing because the label director had weight and spoke of achievement in a way his own words didn't. Each act consolidated the empire. Colleagues deferred, his inbox swelled, his calendar became a ledger of obligations. Outside, recognition glinted like polished marble. Inside, the rooms were crowded and echoing. The false self is not simply false, it's adaptive. Conceived in a context where survival needed certain moves, it later continued those moves in environments that no longer demanded them. Compassion is crucial here. Scolding the man would miss the point. His strategies worked often enough to warrant gratitude. They also kept him from the life he quietly desired. Inner dialogue example.
If you change now, who will you be? What if you lose what you have? The critic's questions were protective in form, but conservative in aim. They offered a cost analysis that favored preservation. The man's task was not to murder the critic, but to offer it new data, that the world could tolerate experiments, that safety could be rebuilt differently. Exercise. Identify 3 roles you habitually perform that do not feel like your core self. Write 1 sentence next to each, explaining what you believe you'll lose if you stop performing that role. Sit with the sentences. Bring compassion to each fear. It's evidence of what you once needed to survive. By the end of the week, a small fracture appeared in the empire. He found himself skipping a meeting he normally would attend, choosing instead to sit in a park and pull an old sketchbook from his bag. The first lines he drew trembled. The first shape felt clumsy.
Yet the tremble also contained a rawness he recognized. He had been so practiced in the art of carrying that the act of setting weight down felt foreign and slightly dangerous. Chapter 4. The Archaeology of Authenticity. He began to dig, not with a metaphorical shovel alone, but with the slow, receptive tools of journaling, memory naming, and the reclaiming of small desires. He sat one evening on the floor amid a scatter of old notebooks and found a folded program from a school play where he'd been cast as a narrator at age 12. The program said in a hand-scrawled note, "We need your voice." He remembered the thrill of being heard, a flame he had kept small for fear of burning bridges. Archaeology is an apt metaphor. You do not bulldoze a site, you brush away layers, catalog fragments, map finds. The man treated his past with the same methodical curiosity. He wrote down phrases he repeatedly heard as a child, traced their origin, and then asked whether those injunctions still applied. Some did, many did not. He cataloged the voices: be quiet, don't be greedy, make others comfortable. Each voice, when named, lost a little of its tear-producing power. Guided journaling prompt. Find a small object from your past, a ticket stub, a children's book, a tool. Hold it. Write for 15 minutes about the memory it opens without censoring. Then answer the question, which part of that memory shaped what I believe I must do to be safe? In the process, he encountered a core wound, thinly veiled, the unspoken phrase that had followed his childhood achievements: don't outshine. It had sounded like kindness, but functioned as a limit. Naming it did not make it vanish, but it made the boundary between his own desires and inherited caution visible. He began to speak the name aloud. Don't outshine. Each repetition made clearer the decision he would have to make: honor those early needs or renegotiate them for the present. A caution is necessary here. If, as you excavate, you uncover deep, painful memories that destabilize you, intense shame, ongoing abuse, symptoms that impair daily function, consider reaching out to a licensed professional. Excavation can unearth weightier materials than a single person should process alone. Therapy is not a failure. It's a kind of excavation support that honors the complexity of deep wounds. Toward the end of the week, he sat with a list he'd made: voices and origins. He drew a line between the voice and the occasion that birthed it. On the other side of the line, he began to write alternatives, plausible actions he could try instead of automatic compliance. Those alternatives were small: a no delivered with a breath, a 30-minute block of unscheduled time to practice a neglected hobby, a question asked aloud in a meeting. He labeled them tentative. The act of drafting alternatives felt like pointing a flashlight down hidden corridors. Not everything would fit or be safe.
The flashlight was simply a beginning. permission didn't always come from people around him. Often it came slowly from within, in the form of small acknowledgments. That was new. That was yours. The last scene in the chapter closed with a small but vivid moment. He stood at the edge of a neighborhood park, sneakers muddied, a sketchbook in his hand, and watched a child teach herself to ride a bike without training wheels. The child's wobble was magnificent, brave, and ordinary. The man recognized the same wobble in himself. The movement forward was precarious, not neat. He smiled, surprised at the wetness in his eyes. For the first time in years, he noticed not the weight he carried, but the possibility of setting it down, if only for short stretches. He pocketed his sketchbook, felt the strap of his bag against his shoulder as if to test its load. The strap was familiar. The city hummed around him with its own urgent demands. In his chest, something lightened enough to give him an idea of the next step. A plan of small practices to keep building new roads and to begin dismantling rooms of the empire that no longer served him. He didn't know the map. He knew, finally, that maps could be redrawn. The decision to carry on would require more than resolve. It would require method. He started drafting such a method that night. Routines to anchor his choice, allies who could witness experiments without fixing, times when he would deliberately rest in unstructured time. The outlines were imperfect, but they were his, and for the first time in a long time, he felt curiosity about how much lighter he might be if he learned to carry less. The next step would not be a grand unveiling. It would be small, awkward, and insistently ordinary. He would need to face the inner critic's louder protests. He would grow accustomed to discomfort as a teacher rather than a verdict. He would, at times, feel loss, and he would also, if he continued, begin to see how the people around him responded to a man who no longer simply carried everything. He left the park with the strap of his bag adjusted, the weight shifting by inches. He folded the list of tentative alternatives into his jacket and walked toward the bus stop, aware of the long roads ahead and of a steady, newly forming sensation that some weights might be set down, even if only for minutes at a time. Chapter 6. Breaking the Addiction. He learned quickly that saying no tasted like copper in the mouth. The first time he let the syllable out to a colleague, "I can't take that on right now," it landed between two polite silences like a small stone thrown into still water. Faces shifted. The meeting resumed. No one demanded to know the contents of his chest. For a few hours he felt oddly buoyant, as if a strap had been loosened. By evening, however, an ache arrived. The inner critic's circuitry hummed louder than before, cataloging the risks he'd just taken. Withdrawal, he discovered, did not always resemble dramatic loss. Often it came as a low, persistent anxiety, a sense of being unmoored, of not having the usual ballast to guide him. Friends who once relied on his availability sent messages he did not immediately answer. An invitation went unanswered, and then a follow-up arrived with a thinly veiled frustration. The empire noticed his absence, and the internal systems designed to preserve him interpreted that absence as danger. Addiction to external validation behaves like other addictions. It trains attention, biases reward systems, and creates an anticipatory economy. You act a certain way, the world responds with safety signals, praise, inclusion, avoidance of conflict, and your nervous system learns to seek those signals. When you pull back, the addiction's withdrawal is predictable. Cravings for approval, shame that masquerades as prudence, panic disguised as prudential thinking. He did not try to stop everything at once. He learned to apply graded exposure to his social life. Small stakes first. Say no to a meeting that really wasn't necessary. Express a mild preference to a barista.
decline the extra task that would add hours to his evening. Each refusal was a short rehearsal for larger acts. Each time his body reacted, tight shoulders, a hollow throat, he practiced an embodied return, slow breath, placing a hand on his sternum, naming the sensation aloud. Here it is again, heat at the collarbone. He kept a record like a scientist. He tracked the context, the sensation, the inner voice, and the outcome. Over weeks, the cravings lost some of their urgency. Data replaced dread. He noticed patterns. Fatigue at the end of the week made him more likely to say yes. Social situations where he felt indebted triggered automatic compliance. Information allowed him to set guardrails. Micro-practice. Graded exposure plan. Choose one small social demand you typically accept automatically. A weekly meeting, a favor, a volunteering slot. Break it into 3 graded steps. Step A, lowest risk, ask for a small modification. Step B, medium risk, suggest an alternative time or person. Step C, highest of the 3, decline politely with an offered solution. Prepare a short script for each step. Practice the script aloud 3 times in private. Execute Step A in the coming week. Record bodily sensations and the actual external response. Repeat once a week, moving slowly toward the next step when anxiety reduces by 20 to 30%. He stumbled. A particularly entrenched script, his partner's family expecting him to host their Sunday dinner, became a test. The old response, automatic and dutiful, would have had him planning, shopping, cooking. Instead, he offered to rotate hosting instead of outright refusing. It felt like a compromise. It also felt like the first time in years he had negotiated his own bandwidth. The reaction was not uniformly positive. A cousin sounded disappointed over the phone. The man felt his chest hollow in an old, familiar way.
That hollow lasted a day. Then it softened. What helped was not only the practice, but the naming. He began to speak to his allies, one friend, one coach, about the withdrawal symptoms themselves. He said, "I feel raw after saying no," and the friend replied, "That makes sense." Witnessing, more than fixing, became a balm that reduced the urgency of the craving. Allies were not rescues, they were mirrors that reflected back a livable reality. A note of caution in this work. If the sensations you uncover are overwhelming, if panic, intrusive thoughts, or dissociative responses become frequent, reach out to a licensed mental health professional. Graded exposure is effective, but should be guided when trauma or severe anxiety is in play. By the chapter's end, he had a new steady hand, a small, worn index card in his wallet with 3 scripts and the words breathe, name, choose. On hard days, he repeated the mantra until the impulse to comply settled into something he could observe rather than obey. The addiction to external approval remained, but its claws were blunted by repeated small refusals and by the companionship of a few people who witnessed his experiments without pressuring him to revert. Chapter 7. Reclaiming Your Desires. The sketchbook would not leave him alone. It slipped into his bag like a secret, flapped open at the bus stop, and drew his pen as if by gravity. One evening he stayed late at work, less to finish a task and more to walk past a window where a gallery hung a poster for a life drawing class. The immediacy of desire, sharp and childish, arrived like a bell. He remembered the small, pure delight of making marks that were only for him. Reclaiming desire was never an act of indulgence alone. It was a reorientation to inner permission. He had been trained to mislabel longings as distractions and to reframe joy as impractical.
The belief system that had kept him safe assumed that desires were luxuries to be postponed, so reclaiming them required both courage and method. He started small, 20 minutes on Saturday mornings for a hobby, no phone in sight. The first week, he felt guilty the entire time he drew. In the second week, the guilty noise quieted to a hum. In the third week, he noticed that the joy had a different texture, less thirst, more steady warmth. Desires, he discovered, were not always hunger. Sometimes they were gentle, like sunlight through blinds. Values work joined desire work. He sat with a list and asked a practical question: which desires align with the person I want to be in 5 years? He did not ask whether each desire would make him famous or wealthy. He asked whether they made life meaningful. Some did, some didn't. Reclaiming was as much subtraction as addition. He began giving up small things he no longer valued to make space for those he did. Micro-exercise, values and desire inventory. Write a list of 10 activities you have wanted to do in the last 5 years.
Beside each item, write A. Will this add meaning to my life in 1 year? B. What is one 20-minute step I can take this week to test it? Choose one item and schedule that 20-minute slot. Commit to it as an experiment, not as a vow. There were small social consequences. Colleagues noticed less of him around late into the night. His partner noticed the sketchbook and asked a question that veered into something tender. "Are you happy?" He realized he did not have an easy answer. The question prompted a conversation that was both awkward and necessary. He learned to say, "I'm learning what makes me alive. That feels messy." The partner nodded, sometimes impatient, sometimes curious. Authentic desire would require negotiation. It would not be a solo act. Reclaiming also involved rituals. He designed a start-the-day ritual: 10 minutes of warming, hot tea, an unhurried page of drawing, a line of a poem. Rituals built scaffolding for desire, because desire thrives with repeated, protected windows. The ritual was not dramatic, it was consistent. After a month, he noticed small shifts in energy. Mornings tasted fuller, choices felt more intentional. There was grief, too. Not every desire could be pursued now. He had responsibilities that mattered. The practice was about plausibility and permission rather than instant liberation. He learned to bargain wisely, devoted weekends to family, short weekday windows to practice. The trade-offs felt chosen rather than defaulted. He also began to reconnect with an inner child who loved without calculation. He kept a small object on his desk, a cheap plastic toy from a childhood memory, a talisman of unashamed curiosity. When he felt the old urge to perform, he touched the toy and whispered, "Later, I promise." Promising to his inner child was different from promising to the critic. It was honoring a lineage of desire. The chapter closed on the man taking his first beginner class at the community center. The instructor mispronounced his name and then, without drama, praised a sketch that was ordinary and brave. Walking home, he felt lighter in the sense that he was doing an act simply because it mattered to him. The weight he had carried did not disappear, it shifted, angled toward a new balance where desire had a shelf alongside duty. Chapter 8. Authentic Decision-Making. 2 offers arrived within a month. One was a promotion at work, a definite increase in salary and status, but a role that required his evenings and tightened his creative time. The other was a modest consulting gig that allowed a flexible schedule and space for his growing practice of drawing and teaching. Old scripts wrote his reply: safety equals promotion, desire equals foolish risk. The inner accountant ran projections, the inner child scribbled a different balance sheet. Decision-making had always been a battleground: past survival strategies, future uncertainty, and present sensation.
He found that when choices felt heavy, the body was the best advisor. He adopted a somatic decision test. Present the options. Notice where sensations land in his body. Attend to the timeline of those sensations. Did excitement come first or dread? Did the chest open or tighten? He sat in a cafe, phone switched off, and tried the method. He imagined saying yes to the promotion. At first, his mind rehearsed all the right reasons, the prestige, the security. Then a pressure built in the back of his throat, like a hand compressing his voice. He imagined saying yes to the consulting work. A warmth rose behind his sternum and his jaw unclenched. Data emerged. One option triggered constriction, the other triggered expansion. Somatic tests are not infallible, they are inputs among many, but they had the advantage of cutting through rationalization. He combined them with practical architecture, timelines, what-if scenarios, buffer plans, and a 3-tiered safety net for finances if he chose the lower-paying option. He did not advise himself to quit and jump without preparation. He planned. Micro-practice, somatic decision test. Sit with 2 options. Close your eyes. Imagine choosing option A. Notice 3 bodily sensations and how long they last. Repeat for option B. Note which option creates a steadier, more integrated posture. Then ask, what practical steps could make the preferred option less risky? List 2 concrete steps and 1 fallback plan. He tested his conclusion with a trusted ally. The conversation was less about being told what to do and more about being asked clarifying questions. What does this choice ask of your time? What relationships will be affected? The process of being asked helped him see consequences without becoming overwhelmed by hypothetical catastrophes. There was moral complexity. A team he managed would be reshuffled if he took the promotion. A colleague he liked might be passed over. His decision would ripple. Authenticity required that he take responsibility for those ripples, communicate honestly, offer support, and design transitions that minimized harm. Authentic choices were not mere personal fulfillment, they were moral acts with social consequences. And a reminder for deeper wounds. If you find decisions trigger traumatic responses, flashbacks, immobilization, or dissociation, please seek a licensed therapist or clinician to help you navigate those choices safely. Structured support is a strength, not a defeat. In the end, he chose the consulting path with a cautious ramp-up. He negotiated a part-time arrangement with his employer to pilot the transition, a bridge that balanced livelihood with experimentation. The first month was messy, money tightened, relationships shifted, but he felt a steadier center. He learned to tolerate ambiguity without collapsing into default compliance.
The chapter closed with him sitting at his desk one evening, 2 calendars on the wall, and a felt sense that he could live into a life that contained both meaning and constraints. The decision did not magically remove fear. It provided him with a scaffold and a plan to test the new identity in manageable steps. Chapter 9. Building Authentic Relationships. The first honest conversation he had with his partner felt like a rehearsal for something sacred. They were in the kitchen, the evening light slanted across the table, and he said, "I want to tell you something I haven't been brave enough to say." The words trembled, his throat tightened. The old script predicted conflict. He had prepared a short preface, a calm tone, and a clear boundary to offer. Authentic relationships do not emerge spontaneously from truth-telling alone. They require differentiated intimacy, the capacity to remain oneself while staying emotionally present for another. In practice, this meant 3 skills he practiced regularly: clarity of message, management of reactivity, and mutual curiosity. Clarity of message. Use plain language.
"I need time on Sunday afternoons for my drawing" is more useful than "I need more space." Management of reactivity. When his partner reacted with hurt, he practiced slowing the conversation down, naming the emotion, "I hear surprise and maybe disappointment," and waiting for the emotional surge to subside before offering solutions. Mutual curiosity. Asking, "Help me understand what you need in this change," rather than assuming it was only about him. Micro-practice. Boundary script. Draft a short, loving script for a boundary you need to set. Include the fact, "I will be unavailable Sundays afternoon," a brief reason connected to a value, "I use that time to create," and an offer, "I can handle the grocery run Friday if that helps." Practice aloud 3 times. Try it in a low-stakes moment. Not every conversation landed well. Once a family member took his new boundary personally and weaponized guilt. The man recognized old patterns. When another's discomfort increased, his instinct was to fold. He trained a new response, curiosity plus firm limits. He said, "I hear this feels difficult for you. I also need to keep this time. How can we make the weekend workable?" The negotiation was imperfect. The family member sulked. Time and the consistency of his boundary eventually reoriented expectations. He also learned to create safe witnesses, people who could hold his experiments and give honest, compassionate feedback. An authentic friend is not an echo chamber. They call you to your values and also remind you of your progress. He had one friend who in the early months would ask bluntly, "Are you doing this to be different or because it feeds you?" The question stung and was useful. Differentiated intimacy also included the ability to tolerate someone else's disappointment without capitulating. He practiced saying, "I understand this hurts you. I will not change this for now. Let's find a way to meet both our needs." The practice did not always satisfy both parties immediately. Sometimes it created temporary friction. He learned that short-term relationship discomfort was not always a sign of failure. There were micro-boundaries he tested publicly, stepping away from an overly long work dinner, turning off email at a set hour, and asking for input instead of defaulting to solving. Each boundary change reconfigured how people showed up. Some adjusted easily, others resisted. Both results taught him information about who valued adaptation and who preferred him in the old role. By chapter's end, he had a small ritual for repair. If a conversation escalated, he would offer a pause and a scheduled time to return to the topic. That simple structure reduced the impulse to fix everything immediately and allowed emotions to settle. Relationships, he discovered, were not fixed states, but ongoing negotiations. Authenticity did not guarantee harmony. It required steady practice and the courage to be imperfect in company. Chapter 10. The Authentic Life. Integration was less a finish line and more a choreography. He applied choice architecture to his daily life, arranging the environment so the desired choices became the easiest. At home, he removed one evening meeting and replaced it with a creative slot. At work, he blocked no meeting mornings twice a week. Financially, he built a buffer equal to 3 months of expenses before reducing salaried hours. Architecture created gravitational pulls toward the life he intended. Small designs compounded. At his desk, he replaced the default coffee order that encouraged long office lunches with a quick thermos and a walk. He automated bill payments to reduce decision fatigue. He scheduled one evening a week to connect with a friend who held him accountable without judgment. These were not flashy systems, no radical overhaul, but the sum produced meaningful change. Micro-practice. Environment audit. Walk through your primary environments, work desk, kitchen, phone home screen. Identify 2 friction points that push you toward old behaviors. For each, design one simple change that makes the authentic choice easier. Example, move the phone charger to another room to discourage night scrolling. Implement one change this week and observe the effects. Authenticity at work required translation into language leaders could hear, predictable availability, clear scope, and effective handoffs. He learned to present his boundary choices as experiments with measurable outcomes. Instead of saying, "I won't work past 6, he said, "I will be unavailable after 6 p.m., but reachable for emergencies by email. I will report results weekly." Presenting boundaries as systems that preserved productivity and reduced burnout helped others accept them without feeling abandoned.
Integrating finances became an exercise in values alignment rather than deprivation. He reallocated a portion of his income toward classes and materials that fed his creative life. He did not advise reckless spending. He built a budget that allowed margin. Margin, he learned, was a practical commitment to experimentation. Home life reshaped itself slowly. Meals were planned collaboratively, chores became negotiated rather than assumed. Free time was protected and honored. The house felt different, not because duties disappeared, but because they were shared and because choices were visible. At the end of the chapter, he sat in his apartment on a Sunday afternoon, a calendar with colored blocks on the wall, green for work, blue for creation, gold for relationships, gray for rest. The visual grid was less about strictness and more about signaling priority. He could see where authenticity had room and where old roles still crowded the schedule. Chapter 11. Handling Resistance. Resistance arrived with predictable cunning. A senior leader, threatened by the man's gentle pushback in a meeting, redeployed a project team without consultation, an apparent punitive nudge. In the family, expectations hardened. "This is how we've always done it," a relative insisted when he asked for a different arrangement. Social systems, like weather, have inertia. They push back. He learned to expect two kinds of resistance, external and internal. External resistance included organizational maneuvers and social expectations. Internal resistance was the critic revving to full power, dredging old justifications for retreat. Both required different tools. For external resistance, he developed a stress inoculation plan, anticipate the likely countermoves, and plan responses that protected his integrity while also reducing collateral harm. He practiced language that held his boundary and the other person's dignity. "I hear this feels disruptive. I also need to keep this commitment to my time. How can we redesign around both needs?" was a sentence he used often. For internal resistance, he used data and ritual. He kept a small ledger of experiments with outcomes. When the critic screamed, "You'll lose everything," he opened the ledger and read evidence of small successes. Rituals, daily breath, check-ins with allies, and scheduled rest reduced the critic's fuel. Micro-practice. Stress inoculation worksheet. Identify one likely resistance you anticipate, at work or home. List 3 practical responses that protect your boundary and reduce harm, phrased in neutral, collaborative language. Practice each response out loud. Execute one in the coming 2 weeks. Sometimes resistance had teeth. When the company announced a restructuring, he felt temporarily exposed. He double-checked his buffer, reached out to mentors, and renewed his networking practice, not as a survival panic, but as a strategic habit. He learned not to mistake the presence of risk for imminent disaster.
Risk required planning. Fear required companionship. A professional reminder is useful here. If resistance triggers prolonged anxiety, panic attacks, or severe sleep disruption, consult a mental health professional. Strategies are powerful, but when the body is chronically dysregulated, clinical support can offer stabilization. He also discovered allies in unlikely places. A junior colleague, once the recipient of his old performed agreeableness, approached him and said, "I noticed you changed. It made me think I could too." The ripple effect began. Authentic acts were contagious in modest ways. They created permission in other people to try different moves. By the end of the chapter, he had a toolkit in his pocket: scripts, the stress inoculation worksheet, and a short list of 3 trusted witnesses. Resistance no longer felt like a verdict, but like weather, predictable, sometimes fierce, and navigable with preparation. Chapter 12. Authenticity Mastery System. If earlier chapters had been experiments and repairs, this chapter became architecture. He identified 7 pillars that, when practiced, made authenticity more likely. They were not rules for everyone, but scaffolds he adapted to his life. 1. Rituals of calibration. Daily practices that align sensation to intention. Breathwork, a 5-minute check-in with sensations, a creative warm-up. 2. Boundary infrastructure. Pre-written scripts and a small, consistent set of boundaries that clarified availability. 3. Micro-learning cycles. Short, frequent experiments and reflections, 2-week tests, data collection, adjustments. 4. Community of witnesses. A small group that provides non-judgmental feedback and accountability. 5. Choice architecture. Environmental and financial designs that make desired actions easier. 6. Meaningful redistribution. Conscious reallocation of time, money, and attention to match values. 7. Legacy practices. Small acts that model authenticity for others, mentoring, storytelling, and public accountability. Each pillar contained simple habits he could practice weekly. He created a weekly plan with a grid that balanced work, art, relationships, rest, and learning. The plan was not rigid. It had room for improvisation. It asked him to mark 3 non-negotiables each week: 1 creative slot, 1 restoration slot, 1 relational slot. Microtool. Weekly plan. On Sunday evening, block 3 non-negotiables for the coming week. Keep them visible. At midweek, do a 10-minute temperature check. What's working? What needs shifting? At week's end, journal a short note. 1 success, 1 learning, 1 curiosity. He treated the mastery system like a garden that required seasonal attention. Some pillars needed daily watering, others required monthly pruning. He recognized mastery as habitual, not heroic. True mastery involved failing gracefully and learning faster. He also learned to scale. Not every pillar required equal attention at every moment. During high-demand work phases, he tightened the boundary infrastructure and leaned on allies. During fertile creative periods, he increased the number of learning microcycles and decreased meeting load. A breakthrough came when he taught a small class at the community center about small acts of courage. The students were mixed ages, many tentative. He felt awkward stepping into the role of teacher. Some old scripts told him he wasn't an expert, but the act of showing up and sharing his experiments created a new identity, someone who models practice rather than performs perfection. Teaching consolidated his learning. It made his choices legible to himself. By chapter's end, he felt a new rhythm. The mastery system was a moving architecture that shifted with life seasons. He did not become immune to old pains, but he had tools to catch himself and to return. He had policies for tricky moments and a community who could see him through. Authenticity, he learned, was less a single torch to carry and more a network of smaller lights that made roads visible. Chapter 13. Advanced Authenticity. Authenticity grows thornier as it expands. Leadership introduced paradoxes. The man was invited to lead a project that required a moral call, prioritize transparency and risk short-term reputation, or shield the team and preserve stability. Authenticity demanded honesty, but also care for those who would be affected. He convened a small circle, 2 mentors, 1 peer, and a coach, to run a moral reflection. They explored questions: what harm might truth do? Which harms are avoidable? Who bears the cost? Leadership, he discovered, required a stewardship that balanced candor with prudence. Being authentic did not mean broadcasting every thought at any time. He crafted a plan that mixed transparency with staged disclosure. He rolled communications in phases, offered supports for those most affected, and made himself available for one-on-one conversations. The approach was not perfect. Some colleagues felt blindsided, but the process minimized chaos and preserved trust over time. Advanced authenticity also required managing complexity in relationships. When he chose to step away from a long-running committee to protect his time, a formerly close colleague softened and then cooled. That loss was not personal failure, but relational recalibration. He mourned the change and did not pathologize it. Authentic living rearranged social networks. Some people moved closer, others drifted. Micro-practice. Moral reflection checklist. When facing a complex ethical decision, write down 1. Stakeholders and how they are affected. 2. Short-term harms versus long-term goods. 3. Who needs support during the transition. 4. A communication plan that balances honesty and care. Use this checklist before major announcements. He encountered moral complexity again when a mentee asked for endorsement for a public opportunity that carried reputational risk.
Supporting the mentee could help their career, but also implicated him. He learned to separate support for the person from blanket endorsement of a particular action. He provided coaching language, offered feedback, and created a conditional support plan, support attached to certain safeguards. Advanced authenticity required humility. He admitted mistakes publicly and modeled repair. One evening, he called a meeting to apologize for a mismanaged feedback session. The apology was not theatrical, but direct, acknowledging harm and offering a concrete plan for remediation. The team responded with relief and respect. Repair, he learned, was itself an authentic act that strengthened trust. The chapter closed with him sitting in a dim room after a long day, the weight of leadership present but different, a felt responsibility rather than a burden. He had grown into a person who could hold paradox without collapsing into old survival scripts. Authenticity now included a narrower, clearer definition of whom he served and how. Chapter 14. Living Your Authentic Legacy. A young designer he had once mentored reached out with a trembling email. "Your example encouraged me to apply for a role I thought I didn't deserve." The news landed like sunlight. The man felt the ripple of his experiments extending beyond his immediate life. Legacy was not a heroic monument. It was a string of small permissions given to others. Legacy work invited him to look outward. He began to mentor more intentionally, to write small reflections on the practices that helped him, and to volunteer at a local arts program for teens. His presence there was quiet but steady, an adult who said, "You can try this," and then showed up to see if the attempt survived. Micro-practice. Legacy letter. Write a short letter to someone younger, real or imagined, describing one practice you wish you'd learned earlier. Offer practical steps they could try. Keep it under 300 words. Send it or tuck it into a notebook as a commitment. He discovered that legacy invites paradox. The more you try to push a model onto others, the less authentic it feels. Influence works best when offered as invitation and example. He told stories of his small failures as often as his successes. Students and mentees found it easier to follow a path that included stumbles. Family dynamics shifted too. A niece who watched him negotiate boundaries found language to ask her parents for more autonomy. A former colleague who had once criticized his choices now sent a message, "I'm reading what you wrote about ritual. It helped me set something small." The man felt gratitude and also a new responsibility to steward his practices, so they remained accessible rather than prescriptive.
Legacy also contained constraints. He did not want to produce a culture where authenticity became another demand. He taught nuance, authenticity as practice, not performance, care for the vulnerable, acknowledgement that choices have trade-offs.
He emphasized that authenticity might cost jobs, relationships, or comfort. It was not a guaranteed path to reward. By the end of the chapter, he sat with a simple notion. Legacy is less about the magnitude of your actions and more about the permission you give others to be themselves. The man's life had accumulated small permissions: let someone else rest, speak a truth, try a new craft, and those permissions had multiplied.